I didn't notice it at first when my son began calling, mostly when he needed something. If you had asked me then whether anything had changed between us, I would probably have said no. I would have told you he was busy. I would have said work was demanding, life was expensive, and people his age carry more responsibility now than we ever did when we were young. And all of that would have been true. Still, there are truths that explain things, and there are truths you feel quietly long before you understand them. For a long time, I didn't allow myself to think about the difference between those two. When my son was little, he used to follow me everywhere. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that called attention to itself. He simply assumed that wherever I was going was where he should be too. If I stepped into the garage, he appeared a minute later holding something he had decided belonged there. If I walked out to the yard to fix something near the fence, he came with me and asked questions he didn't yet have the patience to wait for answers to. "Why are you doing that? What's that tool called? Can I try?" Most of the time he didn't actually want to try. He just wanted to be near enough to feel included. There's a particular sound children make when they walk behind you in a quiet house. I used to recognize his footsteps without turning around. Slightly quicker than mine. Slightly uneven. Always close enough that I never wondered where he was. Saturday mornings were our time. His mother preferred quiet mornings, and our daughter liked to sleep late even when she was young, but my son woke early. Not happily. Not enthusiastically. Just early in the steady way some children do when they're growing fast. He would come into the kitchen rubbing his eyes, sit down at the table, and watch me make coffee as if it were something complicated and important. "Can I have some?" he asked once when he was about 7. "You won't like it," I told him. "I will," he said. He didn't. But he sat there anyway, holding the cup with both hands like it mattered that he was included in the routine. We didn't talk about big things back then. We talked about ordinary things. Which bike he wanted when his old one became too small. Whether his teacher liked the class project he'd worked on all week. Why his friend Daniel always ran faster than everyone else at recess. Children tell you their lives in pieces like that. They don't realize they're telling you something important. They think they're just talking. Those mornings felt simple at the time. Now I understand they were something else entirely. They were the beginning of a habit between us. Being together without needing a reason. As he grew older, our routines changed but the habit stayed. There were years when we worked on things side by side in the garage. Not always efficiently. Sometimes we spent more time deciding what to do than actually doing it. But he liked the feeling of working towards something with me. We fixed a broken shelf once that didn't really need fixing. We replaced a bicycle tire that would probably have lasted another year. We painted a section of the fence that no one else would ever notice. He didn't come to those afternoons because the projects mattered. He came because we were doing them together. I didn't think about that then. Parents rarely do. You assume those kinds of afternoons will always exist in some form. Even when children grow older. Even when their lives begin to stretch beyond the boundaries of your house. Even when they start building routines of their own. When he became a teenager, I expected some distance. People told me to. Boys pull away from their fathers at that age. They need space. They come back later. Some of that was true. He spent more time with friends. He closed his door more often. He answered questions with fewer words than he used to. But he never stopped coming into the garage when I was there. He never stopped asking for help with things he could probably have figured out on his own. Sometimes he stood beside me without saying anything at all. That was enough. Those were the years when our conversations changed from questions about school into conversations about plans. What he wanted to do after graduation. Where he thought he might live someday. Whether he wanted a job that kept him close to home or one that took him somewhere new. I remember one evening in particular when we sat on the back steps after dinner. The sun had already started to disappear behind the houses across the street, and the air had that quiet feeling summer evenings get when the day finally slows down. "I don't think I want to stay here forever," he said. I nodded. "I didn't either," I told him. Did you know where you wanted to go? He asked. No, I said. I just knew I wanted to see what else was out there. He thought about that for a moment. I think I feel the same way, he said. I remember feeling proud when he said that. Not because he wanted to leave. Because he trusted me enough to tell me he did. When he eventually moved out, I expected things to change. Of course I did. Every parent expects that moment. But I also believed something else. I believed the closeness we had built over all those years would stay with us in some form. Not the same form, but something recognizable. And for a while it did. He called often during the first year after he moved. Sometimes about small things. Sometimes about practical things. Sometimes just to say he had finished a long day and was driving home. Those calls didn't feel like requests. They felt like continuations. Like the same conversations we had always had, just happening from different places. I never kept track of how often they came. I didn't need to. They arrived naturally. Then, slowly, something began to change. At first it was so small I barely noticed it. The calls became shorter. Not fewer. Just shorter. Instead of telling me what he had done during the day, he told me what he was about to do next. Instead of describing the people he worked with, he mentioned them only when they were part of a problem he needed help thinking through. I told myself this was normal. Life becomes busier when you're building something of your own. Responsibility replaces conversation. That's what I believed then. And maybe part of that belief was correct. Still, there was another change I noticed later. He began calling at particular moments. Not randomly. Not casually. There was a pattern I didn't recognize right away. One evening he called while I was sitting in the living room reading. Hey, he said. Are you busy? No, I told him. I wanted to ask you something. The question was simple. He needed advice about a repair in his apartment. We talked about it for a while. I told him what I thought. He thanked me. Then the call ended. There was nothing unusual about that. Not then. A few days later he called again. Same tone. Same beginning. Are you busy? This time it was about paperwork he didn't understand. We talked again. He thanked me again. The call ended again. Still nothing unusual. At least that's what I told myself. The third time it happened, I noticed something I hadn't noticed before. I was in the kitchen making dinner when the phone rang. His name appeared on the screen. And before I answered, I found myself wondering what he needed. That thought surprised me. Not because there was anything wrong with helping him. Helping him had been part of my life for decades. But because I had expected something else. A story. A question that wasn't practical. A conversation that didn't have a purpose. Instead, there was always a purpose now. Always something specific he needed. Always something I could solve. I answered the phone anyway. Hi, I said. Hey, he replied. Can I ask you something? There it was again. We talked for 10 minutes. Maybe less. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen a little longer than I needed to. Thinking about something I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't frustration. It was simply awareness. Awareness that the shape of our conversations had begun to change. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing the pattern more clearly. He still called. But almost always for a reason. Insurance questions. Car problems. Advice about work decisions. Information he assumed I would know because I had known things like that when he was younger. And I did know. Most of the time. I answered every question he asked. Gladly. That part never changed. Still, something inside me began to feel quieter after each call. Not emptier. Just quieter. One Saturday morning, I made coffee the same way I had for years. Without thinking, I set 2 cups on the table. Then I stopped. Looked at the second cup. And realized I didn't know why I had done that. He wasn't coming over. There had been no plan. No message. No call. Just habit. I stood there for a moment before putting the second cup back in the cupboard. That was when I began to understand something I hadn't been ready to admit before. He still called me. But he didn't call the way he used to. And I wasn't sure yet what that meant for us. After that morning in the kitchen, I began noticing things I had probably been seeing for a long time without allowing myself to understand them. That's something that happens as you get older. Not because you become less observant. Because you become more careful about what you let yourself feel. There are changes in family life that arrive quietly. They don't announce themselves. They don't ask permission. They simply settle into your days one small difference at a time until one afternoon you realize something that used to feel natural now feels slightly unfamiliar. For a while, I told myself I was imagining things. My son still called. He still asked my opinion. He still trusted me with the practical parts of his life. And that should have been enough. In many ways it was. But there is a difference between being needed and being included. I didn't have words for that difference yet. I only felt it. One evening he called while I was in the garage. I had been sorting through a box of tools I hadn't used in years. Not because I needed to. Just because it was something to do on a quiet weekday after dinner. The phone rang in my pocket. I recognized his name immediately. "Hey," he said when I answered. "Hi," I replied. "Everything all right?" "Yeah," he said quickly. "I just wanted to ask you something." The sentence came so naturally to him. The same sentence he had used before. The same one he would use again later. He asked about a noise his car was making. I listened carefully while he described it. I told him what I thought it might be. I suggested what he should check first. He thanked me the same way he always did. Then there was a short pause. For a moment, I expected him to stay on the phone. Not for any reason in particular. Just because that's how things used to be. Instead, he said, "Okay, I'll try that. I'll let you know if it works." "All right," I said. And the call ended. I stood there in the garage holding the phone in my hand long after the line went quiet. It wasn't the conversation itself that stayed with me. It was what didn't happen afterward. There had been a time when he would have told me where he was driving later that evening. Or what he had done earlier that day. Or something small that had made him laugh. Now the conversation had a purpose. Once the purpose was finished, so was the call. That was new. And I was only beginning to understand how often it was happening. A few days later I saw him in person. He came by unexpectedly one Saturday afternoon. Not because he had planned to visit. Because he needed help moving something heavy from his apartment, and thought it might be easier if we used my truck. "Do you have time?" he asked when he stepped into the house. "Of course," I said. I always had time. We drove across town together. The drive should have felt familiar. For years, we had spent hours in the car talking about things that didn't seem important at the time but somehow mattered later. Now the drive felt shorter than it used to. Not because the distance had changed. Because the conversation had. We talked about traffic. About the weather. About where he planned to put the furniture once it was moved. Nothing was wrong with the conversation. It was simply smaller than it used to be. When we arrived at his apartment, he showed me what needed to be moved. A heavy desk he had bought secondhand. We worked together the same way we always had. Carefully. Side by side. For a little while, it felt like those afternoons in the garage when he was younger. The same quiet cooperation. The same shared rhythm. When we finished loading the desk into the truck, he stood there wiping his hands on his jeans. "Thanks," he said. "No problem," I answered. We drove it back to my house and unloaded it into the garage so he could pick it up later with someone else. When everything was finished, he checked his phone. "I should get going," he said. "Stay for a while if you want," I told him. "I just made coffee." He hesitated for a second. "Not long. Just long enough for me to notice." "I can't today," he said. "I promised I'd meet someone." "Another time," I said. Yeah, he answered. Another time. He left a few minutes later. I stood in the driveway watching his car disappear at the end of the street. There was nothing unusual about what had happened. He had come. We had worked together. We had talked. He had thanked me. Still, something inside me felt quieter afterward. Not disappointed. Not exactly. Just aware that the visit had been shaped around what he needed. Not around simply being together. Later that evening, I sat in the living room longer than I usually do without turning on the television. The house was still. The same kind of stillness I had grown used to over the years. But that night it felt different. Not heavier. Just more noticeable. I thought about something I hadn't considered clearly before. When children are young, they need you in ways that fill your entire day. When they grow older, they still need you. But the shape of that need changes. And sometimes it becomes harder to see where you still belong inside it. A few weeks later, he called again. This time about a decision he was trying to make at work. He explained the situation carefully. Asked what I thought. Listened to my answer. Thanked me again. Then he said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. I always know you'll help me figure things out. He meant it as a compliment. I understood that. Still, after we hung up, I found myself sitting quietly at the kitchen table thinking about what he had said. I had always been someone he could depend on. That part of our relationship hadn't changed. But I began wondering when I had stopped being someone he simply wanted to talk to. That thought surprised me. Not because it was painful. Because it felt honest. One afternoon not long after that, I opened a drawer in the hallway where we used to keep old papers and school notes. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. Just moving things from one place to another the way people do when they're trying to stay busy. At the bottom of the drawer, I found a folded piece of paper I recognized immediately. It was something he had written when he was about 10 years old. A note from school. The handwriting was uneven. The letters pressed too hard into the paper. "Dad is the best helper," it said. I sat down on the bench near the hallway and read that sentence again. Dad is the best helper. It was such a simple thing for a child to write. And yet, reading it now, I understood something I hadn't understood when he first brought it home. Helping had always been part of how he saw me. Not the only part. But an important one. For a long time, that role had felt natural. Comfortable. Even meaningful. Now I began to wonder whether it had quietly become the center of how he reached for me. And whether I had noticed the moment when that happened. That evening I walked past the garage and stopped in the doorway. The same place where we had spent so many afternoons together when he was younger. The tools were still there. The shelves still looked the same. Even the old workbench hadn't moved. But something about the room felt different now. Not empty. Just quieter than it used to be. I stood there for a long time before turning off the light and closing the door. And for the first time, I allowed myself to think something I had been avoiding for weeks. My son still called me. He still needed me. But I was beginning to wonder if he mostly called when he needed something, and not simply when he wanted me. After that evening in the garage doorway, I began paying closer attention to something I had been trying not to name for a long time. Not because I was upset with my son. Because I was beginning to understand how easy it is, as a parent, to accept changes without ever asking yourself what they mean. For years, helping him had been one of the most natural parts of my life. It never felt like a responsibility. It never felt like a burden. It felt like what fathers do. You answer questions. You fix things when they break. You explain paperwork no one else wants to read. You help carry furniture up narrow staircases and stand outside holding flashlights when someone else is trying to see under the hood of a car. That's how love often looks between fathers and sons. Quiet. Practical. Reliable. But sometime over the years, I had stopped noticing whether he still called just to talk. Not because those calls had disappeared completely. Because I had become so used to being helpful that I no longer expected anything else. That realization stayed with me for several days. It didn't make me angry. It didn't even make me sad. It simply made me thoughtful in a way I hadn't been before. One Sunday afternoon, I decided to do something I almost never did. I called him first. There was no reason. No question. No problem to solve. I just wanted to hear his voice. He answered on the third ring. "Hey," he said. "Hi," I replied. "Am I catching you at a bad time?" "No," he said. "What's up?" The question was simple. But I noticed something in it right away. He assumed there must be a reason. "No reason," I told him. "I just wanted to see how you're doing." There was a short pause. Not uncomfortable. Just unfamiliar. "Oh," he said. "I'm good." We talked for a few minutes after that. About work. About the weather. About something small that had happened earlier in his week. The conversation was fine. Easy. Still familiar in its own way. But I noticed something else as we talked. He kept waiting for the question. For the thing I needed. For the reason I had called. When the conversation ended, he said something gently that stayed with me longer than I expected. "Everything okay?" "Yes," I said. "Everything's fine." And it was. Still, I sat at the kitchen table for a while after the call ended, thinking about how unusual it had felt for both of us that I had called without a reason. For most of his life, I had been the person he called when something needed fixing. Not the person he called when nothing did. Later that week, he came by the house again. This time it really was just a visit. At least that's what he said when he stepped through the door. "I was in the neighborhood," he told me. "I'm glad you stopped," I said. We sat in the kitchen together the way we used to when he still lived at home. For a while we talked about ordinary things. About a neighbor he had recently met. About a project he was working on at his apartment. About whether he thought he might move again next year. The conversation moved easily. Comfortably. And then, somewhere in the middle of it, he said something that changed how I understood everything that had been happening between us. "I don't always know what to talk about unless I need help with something," he said. He smiled a little when he said it. Not apologetically. Just honestly. It took me a moment to answer. Not because I didn't understand him. Because I suddenly understood him very clearly. "That's all right," I told him. "You don't always have to have something to fix." He laughed softly. "I guess I never thought about it like that." I realized then that he hadn't been pulling away from me. He had simply grown into a different way of being close. For him, calling me with questions was still connection. Still trust. Still part of how he knew we belonged to each other. I had been measuring closeness by something else. By the way we used to talk when he was younger. By the way he used to come into the garage without needing a reason. By the way he used to sit at the kitchen table on Saturday mornings just to be near me. But adulthood changes the shape of those moments. It doesn't erase them. It reshapes them. Later that afternoon, we walked out into the garage together. He hadn't asked for help with anything. He was just following me the way he used to when he was small. We stood there looking at the old workbench for a minute. "I still like this place," he said. "Me too," I answered. There was a quiet pause after that. The kind of pause that used to happen when he was a teenager and didn't yet know how to say what he was thinking. Then he said something I hadn't expected. "I always feel like things make more sense after I talk to you." It was such a simple sentence. And yet it changed something inside me. For years I had been thinking about what he asked me for. Advice. Help. Solutions. Practical answers. But I hadn't been thinking about what he was really doing when he called. He was still reaching for me. Just in the language he understood best. That evening after he left, I made coffee the same way I always do. Out of habit, I set 2 cups on the table again. This time I didn't put the second one back in the cupboard. I left it there for a moment. Not because I expected him to walk through the door. Because I understood something I hadn't understood before. He still knew where to find me. He still trusted me. He still needed me in ways that mattered. They just didn't look the way they used to. And as I stood there in the quiet kitchen holding my cup, I realized something else too. Sometimes our children don't stop calling because they only need something. Sometimes they call because needing something is the only way they know how to stay close.